But I do know this. Someone that knows the region, knows the subject matter, knows the history is Dr. Thomas Ambrosio from North Dakota State University. And he's been my go-to guy on a lot of this. He's a professor of political science, and his research interests include international relations and Russian foreign policy. Dr. Ambrosio, good to have you on News and Views.
Glad to be here. I just wish it was under better circumstances. We need to come in or I need to come in sometime and just talk about something fun.
Yeah. Right. Every time we talk, it's, did you see this coming 5 years ago?
I did. I saw that something like this would happen. I think Russia was giving us the signals 15 years ago that they were unhappy with the way things were going. And as we were moving further and further towards Russia with NATO, and as Russia started building up its strength, we saw it 2008 in their invasion of Georgia. We saw the occupation and annexation of Crimea in 2014. This is just an escalation.
So I was, a lot of people are sitting there and you look at the current administration, you say, what could have they done differently? And then you compare it to the administration before. I want to go back one more prior to that. Or I should say two more prior to that. I want to go back to the George W. Bush era, right, because there was a conversation held during that administration about the expansion of NATO. And Condoleezza Rice later came out after not being in office or being Secretary of State. She said that probably wasn't our best day when George W. Bush talked about how nations like Crimea and Ukraine, nations where there's free elections and a democracy, that why wouldn't we consider them being part of NATO? And that, I would guess, to Russia, put up a big red flag.
That was the red line. So what happened was at the Bucharest NATO summit, I believe it was March of 2008. It was in that springtime. And the alliance, under pressure from the Bush administration, said to the Ukrainians and the Georgians that they would have the opportunity to join NATO, and explicitly stated that. And we always had an open door policy, but by putting that kind of in writing, it created certain expectations on the parts of the Ukrainians and the Georgians, which played out that same year in Georgia itself, but then also was us crossing that key red line for Russia. And yeah, that's kind of, Russia is 100% responsible for invading Ukraine. There's no question. But we helped to contribute to the context within which that decision was made.
So now go to the next administration, the Obama administration, and there's a lot of people point to how signals were sent to Russia that with what happened with the annexation of Crimea, America proved we don't care.
Well, I think it happened so quickly that the administration really didn't have any ability to react. We put sanctions on Russia, but it was something that the international community was really not on the same page about, in large part because it was done without violence. It just kind of happened. Happened very, very quickly in the chaos of the overthrow of the Ukrainian government that led to kind of the overall situation, which Russia annexed Crimea. And then also you had the war in the East. And it was, kind of a lot going on at the time. And the administration kind of took its eyes off the prize there. But ultimately, there was very little we could do. We're not really going to confront Russia over Crimea.
Was NATO and the United Nations, did they deal themselves a hand like we did in Ukraine?
Well,
when it came to Crimea?
Well, yeah, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the annexation, but ultimately that has no real strength to it. And you can't get anything through the Security Council because obviously Russia could veto it. Europe put some sanctions on, but of course Europe is really dependent upon them for natural gas. And the notion here was that maybe if we try to play nice with Russia, at least not go 100% harsh, then we could maybe get them to scale things back somehow. I don't know.
Now go another administration. Right. So we've gone from George W. to President Obama to President Trump. There's a lot of people who say that if this was the second term of a Trump administration, Ukraine wouldn't be facing this because President Trump's close relationship with Vladimir Putin and the fact that Vladimir Putin feared Donald Trump and he doesn't fear Joe Biden?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I say there would be a couple of things. It would be interesting to go back in time to change the outcome of the election and see what would have happened. But I think there's a couple of things that we can think about. President Trump was probably less predictable in his foreign policy. So I think the invasion of Ukraine has something to do. There was an expectation of predictability on the part of the U.S. administration now, whereas you probably would not have gotten that with President Trump. Also, Trump was probably less enamored with NATO, as we know. And therefore, maybe Putin would have thought, well, maybe they won't be thinking about expanding into Ukraine. Whereas President Biden comes into office and is like, yeah, we're still on board for this process. I'm not sure about the fear issue, but it still may have happened anyway. A certain point may have been reached.
So I don't want to involve you in my politics, and you don't teach that. You just give an overview in your classroom. I realize that your job isn't to teach or have people be one political party or the other. But I'm not a big Donald Trump supporter. I don't hide that on air. That being said, if you take a look at what Donald Trump and his relationship with Putin was, you have to question if it was the uncertainty, Professor Ambrosio, if it was the uncertainty, I would suggest that if he ever was going to invade Ukraine, what better administration to do it under than one that doesn't really like NATO, like the Trump administration did, than one that believes that you're a genius when you do attack, and yet he didn't do it then, which would take away my argument of, boy, Russia's got a friend in the White House, does it not?
That's certainly one way to think about it. It also could have been the Russians needed a certain amount of time to build up their military.
Well, if they built it up, they didn't do a very good job.
They did not do a very good job. Well, the problem was that the Russians, now what we're seeing, we're about 40 days in, or roughly in terms of time. And the Russians have been defeated around Kyiv, and then we'll get to Bucha in a little bit because that's kind of where we're seeing these atrocities. They're retreating from certain areas, withdrawing, as we say, but they did not fight the way they were supposed to. They fought poorly, not just in terms of how they fought, but also the plan itself. So they did. Our expectations of what Russia would do based upon their military doctrine is actually not what they did. It's like they completely forgot all their training, all their planning. They just kind of threw things in willy-nilly, and we saw the results. And good for the Ukrainians. They were able to hold out. They were able to resist it, and then now we're seeing them beginning to push the Russians back. And now the Russians are refiguring or resetting their context for what they're going to do in the future.
I always wonder if, because some of these armies in certain ways, the way they did in Ukraine, have been on the shelf for so long, if this just wasn't an example of something that was so dusty you had no idea whether it'd work or not.
Well, actually, the Russians fought in Georgia. It was a very brief war. They've been fighting in Syria, but that's kind of a different fight than a full-scale conventional fight. And I think they should have been able to do what they do best, which is use large forces, but they just didn't do it. They didn't bring in all their assets, and what eventually they would bring in kind of piecemeal. And that's the weird thing about this. One day we'll know what happened. When the insiders are able to tell us from Moscow, but at this point, it's baffling.
Dr. Ambrosio, we were talking before the break about how we got up to the comfort of a Russia feeling as though they could invade Ukraine and probably have the world let them do it, but that hasn't happened. Yes, when you see the mass murders in Bucha and other places, I understand it. I get it. We're appalled. We're giving weapons, those type of things, but we don't have boot on the ground. But we're not doing business in Russia. I mean, this is a generational thing. I mean, we're not going to do business in Russia for a long time.
These sanctions are going to last for a very, very long time. U.S. And Europe is going to be largely out of Russia. Now, if there's enough money to be made, if there's a peace agreement, maybe some companies will go back. But it's going to be very difficult for especially the U.S. administration, but maybe even some European countries to go back on the sanction that they imposed, just because of the optics of it, especially when we have situations like in Bucha, in which you have these mass murders, you have war crimes being committed, crimes against humanity, and no one's going to be punished for it, at least in the short term. And without that, you may not see a willingness to back down on Russia. Of course, that can have the opposite effect. Russian elites have now kind of rallied around the flag. At a certain point, Russia may benefit because it can actually direct its import of investment elsewhere. And you're going to start seeing China invest more, as well as other countries that are more willing to do business with Russia.
I think that a lot of people understanding the U.S. government and being around politics as much as what I have at pretty high levels, quite frankly, I've come to realize that there is a select group of people that really, really have a say in how a government runs. And it happens here too. If we don't believe it happens here, we're completely void of any common sense. When Clarence Thomas's wife, you got a Supreme Court justice's wife attending a rally that's how small that inner circle in DC is. That's my point. Is it that small in Russia? And the reason I ask this is because the oligarchs have been living a life that you and I would be like, wow, what excess. That's gone to them. Their life has changed forever. Are they going to put up with a guy like Vladimir Putin blowing their life up like this?
Ultimately, they're going to have to, and whatever assets they have in Russia are going to be dependent upon keeping in the good graces of Vladimir Putin. And this is one of the kind of effects that I guess we didn't think about when we start seizing the oligarchs' assets. And the oligarchs, of course, these people who became incredibly rich, especially during the 90s when the Soviet Union fell and they had rapid privatization of state-owned industries. But if we seize everything from outside, all they have is what's inside Russia. And in order to keep even that, they need to be very much on the side of Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir, in terms of the circle, Vladimir Putin is a very small circle. It's not even, it's much smaller than what we have even in the United States. We're talking about, maybe dozens of people total, if that. And he governs that country, not with an iron fist, but he governs the country in a way that he is clearly in charge, and any factions have to somehow work together, but in order to, say, move away from that, but he's very good at splitting those factions.
How does this end? What do you see as determining factors for what happens here?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is that Russia is withdrawing from around Kiev. So the battle for Kiev is over, or for Kyiv is over. We're starting to uncover more war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we're seeing in Bucha right now. And as the Russians pull back and the Ukrainians move in there, we're going to see more and more atrocities. The Russians are going to shift their main axis of battle towards the east. So this would be to retake all of the territories that were originally part of the Donbas region under Ukraine that have not been under control yet by the pro-Russian separatists. That's going to be their main focus. Mariupol, which is that city on the coast in the Azov Sea, is still somehow holding out. They're fighting building to building, probably parts of buildings to parts of buildings. Once that falls, then Russia will have a land bridge between Crimea and the Donbas region, which also connects to Russia. And then Russia, you're going to start seeing a real push for a ceasefire so that the Russian can begin digging into that territory and either force Ukraine to recognize parts of it as part of Russia, or simply to create a new status quo in which they control this territory. And the idea of having an entire Ukraine within Russia or under Russian influence, that's got to be dead at this point. And the Russians will take what ultimately might not be considered a true loss. They have that land bridge, they have certain territories, and if they can get Ukraine to accept neutrality and never join NATO, that's kind of a win for them. It's a dirty win. It's almost a Pyrrhic victory, but it's still, in many ways, maybe a lowercase W.
And what if Ukraine says no? You don't get any of this after what you've been doing in Bucha and other places like that. No, we can't, give anything away to you because our people have died in the streets. Our soldiers have fought so valiantly. No, we're not giving anything.
Then the Russians will keep shelling cities. The beatings will continue until morale improves.
So then it begs this question.
Russian policy is just simply hurting the Ukrainians until they eventually say enough.
So when does NATO step in? Because there's people who are using the term genocide.
Right.
There are people who are describing what happened in Bucha in a way that says, what do you need? What more do you need if you're NATO to realize that there's gives you flashbacks to 1935, 36. What does NATO? What would cause NATO to get into this thing?
I find it difficult to believe a situation which we would. There is no support for a war with Russia, and ultimately a NATO intervention would most likely cause a war with Russia, and that is a bridge too far, so to speak. And both countries have nuclear weapons, or both sides have nuclear weapons, and there's and also Russian nuclear doctrine is what's called escalate to de-escalate, which is if they feel themselves on the losing end of a conventional war, which may result in the defeat of Russia itself, their doctrine says we will begin using nuclear weapons to force the other side to back down, and they've made that very, very clear. So the Russians would have to do so much more for NATO to truly intervene. Maybe begin using chemical weapons. Maybe some people were talking about Russia using some type of a tactical nuke in Ukraine. But even then, it'd be very difficult for us to cross that Rubicon and start a major power war.
So what we see is what we're going to see until some type of a deal's cut.
Exactly. And I do want to I know a lot of people using the G word, the genocide word, and we have to be really careful about that language in general, because not every set of atrocities is genocide. People like to use that term politically in order to mobilize the international community to act. Essentially, you said as a community, never again, and now we're seeing this, so it's genocide, you have to do something. What we're seeing is crimes against humanity. We're seeing war crimes. But there's really no evidence at this point of genocide, which requires a very high standard and requires a certain amount of scale in an attempt to eliminate an entire people.
So how would you define genocide?
Genocide is, the definition is essentially an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And it lists a certain number of groups, or certain types of groups. So you really have to intend to destroy the group. And you can make a case that, yes, Russia Putin doesn't consider Ukraine a real country and a really part of Russia, but that's not enough. So it is a really high standard for genocide, which is above and beyond any of the other international crimes. But there's no question at this point that war crimes have been committed by Russia in a variety of ways. War crimes require protection of civilians and protection of civilian objects, and to make distinctions between the two, and clearly Russia has not done that. They've also committed war crimes. Crimes against humanity, which is direct attacks against civilians. And certainly we're seeing that in Bucha, the aftermath of that. And you can have both at the same time, a war crime and a crime against humanity. So we're seeing that happening here. But those are grave crimes, and the International Criminal Court will be investigating it. But they really don't have any power to really do anything. The Europeans are going to investigate it. Individual countries can also investigate and begin prosecutions independently on their own under the universal jurisdiction rules. So
I'd like to take a step back every now and then and say, okay, number one, it's not hard, in my opinion, to see what Vladimir Putin is doing. He doesn't have access to the water he wants. He definitely is sitting here in a country that he wants to. He doesn't believe ever should have been allowed to go away. He wants the old Soviet Union back. I mean, it isn't hard to see all those reasons vis-a-vis he doesn't want them involved in NATO to be Ukraine. I get that. I understand that. But the price that he's willing to pay for it on a world stage, the price he's willing to pay for it economically. I mean, these sanctions that are put on, when you have everybody pulling their money out, saying we can't do business with them. I mean, we're not going to do business with them ever again. Not just because, boy, we lost money on this thing, but because the people that we do business with, if they find out we are doing business with him, aren't going to do business with us. And so this is a rock rolling downhill. It's a boulder, and it's coming. And I just don't see in the end what he has left, Dr. Ambrosio, on a world stage.
Right. Well, he at this point, maybe not much more to lose, and that makes him potentially desperate and willing to do almost anything. Also, he's going to be forcing countries to buy his natural gas in rubles, which is interesting because they're going to have to buy the rubles from him, from the central bank of Russia, but also other countries. We'd like to think the world is united against Putin, and a lot of the world is united against Putin, but not all the world.
Right.
A lot of countries that are still willing to do business. A lot of countries in the Middle East, even countries that are close to us. China certainly is. India is still an ally of Russia. They've been an ally of the Soviet Union going all the way back.
China doesn't surprise me, or at least my image of what China is. But where do you see China today? If NATO took even stronger actions against, let's take it even a step farther. Mm-hmm. Let's say NATO uses military force to drive Russia out of Ukraine. Will China come out militarily and support Russia?
No, I don't think China would be willing to do that. I don't think they don't have an alliance the way NATO works. They have what we call kind of tactically an alignment where they are very close together. They have very similar interests and they help each other. But China has been unwilling to cross certain steps, even declaring countries allies and creating those alliances. What this may do, however, is give China possibly some pause about Taiwan, for example. But if I'm sitting in Beijing, I have to realize that or think that the situation in Ukraine is very, very different because it's right next to Europe, and NATO will be united on that issue. When it comes to something like Taiwan, that's a different story. We don't have those already established alliance systems that the U.S. can draw upon, but also the world is far more reliant on China than it is on Russia. Mm-hmm. And what China could get away with, Russia may not be able to.
But it's no different than a bank that you borrow money from back home. You could make the argument that, hey, we borrowed money from China, and so we're dependent upon them. We do business with them. But that goes the other way too. I mean, China doesn't want, or that hometown bank doesn't want you to go broke. They want you to succeed, or else that hometown bank loses money as well. That has to be some of what's happening in China.
I think so. We do have this very strange interdependent relationship, but if they think they could possibly get away with something, they might try to do it. Now, militarily, what's interesting about the situation in Ukraine is what a dedicated, relatively small, relatively weak force can do against an outside invader.
Yeah.
And
armed by
NATO. And Taiwan's well armed, and they're in a much better geographic situation vis-a-vis China. So that might actually give Beijing some pause there. But I don't think China would be as unprepared as Russia did. I think they would do it a little bit better.
I don't think you could be any more unprepared than apparently what Russia was. Doctor, the countries that have stayed out, we talked about China before the break. We alluded to just briefly to India. What about Israel? I mean, when I think of Israel, I think of us. I think of a country that we have always had their back. We've always supported. But yet when I see what Israel is doing in this Ukrainian situation, they've been like Switzerland. They've stayed completely neutral. I mean, how does that play out on a world stage?
Actually, they've been more Switzerland than Switzerland. Switzerland actually supported Ukraine. Israel has to keep its options open, and that's kind of what they're doing here. They are trying to please all sides, and ultimately they may find out that they please none of the sides. But also, Israel has a very strong relationship with Russia, And that
you
goes
said
back,
that on the break.
which is ironic given the fact that they fought so hard in order to get Jews from Russia or from the Soviet Union into Ukraine. But they actually did bring some level of loyalties with them, ironically enough. So you kind of have that faction within Israel, but also in general, Israel realizes as a small country, they can't rely just on the United States. They have to keep their options open. And they've kind of cut deals with all the major powers just in case. And in addition, Israel and Russia have some similarity of interest in terms of radical jihadists in the Middle East. And certainly neither side really wants those. So they kind of, it's this weird constellation of relationships. So, yeah.
So what price could they play on a world stage for this? What if you're sitting here looking at Germany, for example, being one of the, just economically paying a tremendous price, they're the one the pipeline was headed to, for example. If you look at other countries, the United States, I mean, look at what's happening at the gas pump, those type of things. And then you look at Israel and you're like, okay, you didn't pay the price that we all paid. You didn't throw in with everybody. What type of price do they pay with countries like ours later on?
I'm not sure a very large price because they're not actively helping Russia. There's some more sitting on the sidelines. We tend not to punish sideline sitters, especially those that have a tremendous amount of influence and already established allied connections with, say, Germany and the United States. So I don't think they're going to pay a price. The issue would be if China, I think, does more, or if India does more. But even then, in those cases, we have to walk a fine line. The global economy is already in trouble, and we're seeing it play out at home. I mean, all of our living standards are going down just because of inflation. So
okay, the 30 seconds I have left, the Russian people, are they going to stay with Vladimir Putin?
They have no place else to go now. And ultimately, there is a rally around the flag effect that we oftentimes see. And probably Russia is more united now because if you speak out against Russia or against Putin, you're a traitor.
Dr. Ambrosio, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that classroom with everybody out there.